நம்மளுங்க சொன்னா பண்ணிக்கிறோண்டி அண்ணா சிட்டி பண்ணா ஒத்துக்கிறோண்டி புள்ளைய கேட்டா கூட பெற்றுக்கிறோண்டி எதையும் தாங்கும் எதையும் நாங்க தாண்டி
சீப்பா பேசாதல் பொண்ணுங்களுத்தான் தப்பா இது காதல் எங்கள வத்தா நல்ல பையனா மாட்டும் வரைக்கும் ஆடு மாத்தி தான் பார்ப்போம் தினைக்கும்
Be careful, சிரிக்கோ ரோஜா சைக்கோ ராஜா
பேர கேட்டா பலரும் பகிரா நாங்க கேட்டத தருவா பகிரா நீதான் சிரிக்கோ ரோஜா பகிரா நீதான் சைக்கோ ராஜா
பேர கேட்டா அல்லரோ மயிரா நீங்க கேட்டத தருவ மயிரா நாங்க சிரிக்கோ ரோஜா மயிரா நாங்க சைக்கோ ராஜா
பார்த்தா என்னடா அப்பத்தமா பாடிட்டு இருக்க?
वे सजना रब किथे आ 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 सगा मगा मगा पा मगा पा मगा नि प मगा नि सगा नि सा नि सगा नि सा नि सगा नि सा नि सगा नि सा
we have a driver who becomes the perfect driver. It'll take 10 to 15 years, but that's the feathering in that I'm talking about.
And will a child born today, will they ever need to learn how to drive?
A child born today, no, I don't think so.
So within sort of 20 years from now, we will...
I don't think so. Listen, I hear some groans.
And also,
listen, I heard a couple of groans. 1.3 million people die from car crashes every year. 1.3 million people die from car crashes every year. That doesn't count an estimated 20 to 50 million people that are injured. Okay, this is actually a public safety issue. If you look at cars, 96% of cars, 96% of time, cars are sitting there not being used. It is a huge amount of pollution that's caused by these cars being in the road, and a huge amount of wasted time. So the safety is there. Electrification is absolutely key, and sharing these platforms is going to allow us to be much safer and also put our assets where they add value.
But it's quite interesting because when you first came in, I remember you sounding somewhat more skeptical about self-driving cars. You've been converted. Is that a?
The choir has spoken, and I'm listening. It's pretty exciting technology out there. But again, it will be a hybrid technology for some period of time.
What about flying cars? That came as a slight surprise.
Yes, that's a great project that we're working on. It's called Uber Elevate. And it is actually about battery technology.
It would have helped a lot of people here.
I know. I wish that I was available. We'll launch it here if we can. But battery technology is allowing us to have multiple rotors on planes, or helicopters, if you want to call them that. These rotors that are much smaller will be much quieter than helicopters are. Much quieter, much safer. If you add sharing into the equation, you can actually get the economics of going from A to B. We think within 5 to 7 years to a place where normal people would think about taking these flying cars. That'll be the beginning, and then it's about scaling. And we're working with a number of partners right now.
Do you think the regulation on flying cars, I've heard some proponents of it argue that it might be easier than it has been on driverless cars, because driverless cars you have to deal with existing roads, existing everything. Flying cars, essentially you're going into unconquered space.
I think that mayors that are forward-thinking understand that traffic and pollution are a real issue, and I think flying cars can be a significant solution to traffic issues in cities. And these cars, to start with, they're going to be very specific. They'll be kind of highways in the air. There'll be very specific routes that these flying cars go on. They're not going to be able to take you to your backyard and land in your backyard. There'll be these skyports. So there'll be very specific routes that you go on. And I think if you build a regulatory framework that has that kind of structure around it, I think you get to a better solve.
Can I drag you back, somewhat reluctantly, back to the real world? But you have Rajiv Misra, who came in with you from SoftBank.
Yes.
He's going to become a director. Last week, he said that Uber should focus on repairing its market share in the US and on key European markets, rather than going to new ones. Do you agree with that? Is that the way you look at Uber?
I think one of the fundamental strengths of Uber is the global scope that we have. This is
you
a brand.
had that motto, everywhere. What's it? Everywhere for everyone.
Yeah, everywhere for everyone.
Do you want to make it some places for some people?
No, we like the everywhere for everyone. It's much sexier than some places for some people. That's
telling me.
Just not interesting. I do think seriously, though, the global scope that our company brings is important. Our being able to build technology that we can amortize essentially everywhere in the world is hard, but it is part of the fundamental value that we introduce. So I would look at Uber very much as a global brand. That said, we're going to look at all opportunities, but at this point, we are leaning forward. In 2018, for us, is going to be very much a lean forward year for the company.
But without, I'm not trying to create new boardroom tension at Uber, but that would appear that SoftBank is keener on a more limited idea, whilst you're keener on everywhere for everyone.
Well, listen, SoftBank is a very important shareholder. They're our largest shareholder, and many of our shareholders have opinions over what's the right thing to do. Ultimately, the governance of the company is going to be at the board, and we'll have those discussions at the board, and we'll set our long-term strategy, and then execute on it.
One of the things which Uber played, perhaps not very fortunately, a role in was the whole sexual harassment questions and everything to do with that. I suppose one very obvious question, do you think that you have solved that part of the culture? But secondly, do you think that is this time this is a real revolution and it's going to stick?
I think that what was happening at Uber was serious, and I think that while what Uber went through what was difficult, I think the Susan Fowler blog was probably one of the best things that happened for Uber, and it certainly started a movement that's an incredibly important movement of the company. I'd be reticent to say that it's solved.
Yeah.
But it's not an endemic issue within the culture of the company, and I think the company has learned, and I think the company took very harsh and appropriate steps to make sure that kind of behavior is absolutely clear, that kind of behavior is not accepted in any way, shape, or form of the company, regardless of where you are, regardless of if you're a great performer or not. So I think we're at the right place for Uber as a company. But I think in general, we're not where we need to be in terms of women in senior positions, making sure that we're welcoming of women in technology, and we help women really build their careers within our company. There's a great kind of bottoms-up energy there, but we're not where we need to be, and we have a lot of work ahead of us.
On the issue of, you talked about the top performers, is that looking back, and also I suppose looking forward for many of the people in this room, because there are a lot of people's businesses which have been affected by this. If you had to give lessons to other people who are now looking at this issue, perhaps more seriously than they have done before, is the really bad issue, and I suppose I'm thinking in some ways about the media industry in this, is that giving top performers more room for maneuver or whatever than people, or more discretion than people thought? Is that top performers need to be treated the same as everybody else?
I think they absolutely need to be held accountable. One of the really valuable lessons that I got early in my life was actually through Jack Welch, and he said, it's very tempting to allow top performers to misbehave in any way, but for me, he was talking about being aligned with the CEO. Sometimes you allow top performers. The tendency is, well, let them get away with some kind of behavior that is not the right behavior because they're so good. And what Jack told me very early on is that it's the top performers who are problematic culturally that are the most dangerous because they have followership within the company because people look up to them. So he's like the dumb person who is bad culturally. He's not the problem because everyone says, well, that's a dumb person, so who cares? It's the smart person who has followership. So it is incredibly important for the top performers to actually be held to account more radically than anyone else because they're the ones who have followership at the company and they have to set the example. So for me personally, that has absolutely guided how I've managed. Expedia was a company that had, excellent cultural values. And one of the first things we did at Uber was to go out and reset our cultural values, and we call them norms because to me, it's not just these values that you put on the wall and kind of people stare at and it's all nice. It's about behavior. And we set out to change behavior at Uber, and I think that the company was thirsting for it, and we are starting on a path, and I believe it's going to be a positive path.
An inevitable question, I hope you won't regard it as a cheap shot, but you talked about smart people who have followers throughout a company. I mean, Travis would seem to be the epitome of that sort of figure. Is that do you think of him as being in that category of people that Jack Welch was talking about?
I think, listen, Travis was the CEO of the company, and he had incredible followership, and he was held to account, right? I mean, he's no longer the CEO of the company, and he's a board member. He's a big investor, and so he's absolutely going to play a part on the board. But we've also been very clear as a company that we do have to make a break with the past, with how we behaved as a company, and to some extent with the new CEO being a very different kind of a CEO. So in the end, you have to be held accountable, and I think that Travis was held accountable, and at this point, he's a board member and a constructive one at that.
If you look around the world now, where do you see the next competitors to Uber? You've obviously got Lyft breathing down your neck.
Yes, yes.
Where else do they come from?
Well, I think that as you move into a world of autonomy, the position of the car manufacturers, the position of, for example, Google, who's developing Waymo and Waymo autonomous technology, you're going to get a lot of players interested in this space. And a lot of people think about Uber and ride sharing as a significant enterprise, and it is. But the fact is that we account for less than 1% of miles driven on the road now. When autonomy comes in, that number over the next 10 years is going to be closer, I believe, to 15 to 20%. So because we're not yet a true alternative to car ownership, and I believe that as you bring autonomous and you bring the price of mobility down and make it available to everybody, everywhere, then we become a real alternative to car ownership, and that really opens up the market for us, but it also opens us up to many more competitors.
And is Google at the forefront of those competitors at the moment?
Google is one of many. I think that they've developed very strong autonomous technology, but what we think, which is exceptional, is having autonomous technology and the network under one roof, which allows us to use autonomous in a very practical way, nearer than you think.
There's an inherent attraction to light and being human. And I think on a very deep psychological level, light is this way in which we experience the energy surrounding us in a very personal manner. My name is Matt Dilling. I'm the founder of Light Bright Neon Studio, and we manufacture, produce, and restore neon works of art and design. Origins of the creative content of a lot of the work at Light Bright comes from a variety of sources. Sometimes people come with a napkin sketch, some people come with an Adobe Illustrator file, and we have a whole design team who then we kind of work together to help create layouts of what it might look like. Scale it up and create a paper template using a pen plotter. And that paper template actually becomes our guide for what we're going to bend the neon to. We take from the office into the glass shop. We pick out the right size tubing with the right color for the right size project. From there, we heat up the glass tubing. The torches heat the glass well in excess of 1,000 degrees in order for it to get into its molten state. We heat up and bend the glass tubing to match the template. One of our chandeliers has over 100 different bends in it. So each one of those bends has to be marked for a heated up bend. We also have to allow the glass to cool between the bends so that the next area can be worked on and heated up in its own unique fashion. It turns into spaghetti, and then we have to make sure that that spaghetti lines back up and cools to the template. We use a blow hose to connect our mouth to the tube, create a volume that's closed, and we can control the pressure in there with our mouth. There's just a variety of challenges that come up inherently in working with glass. Glass can crack due to stress, and sometimes you'll just have a batch that all it wants to do when it gets near a torch is crack. After we've bent various components, we have to go in using the crossfire or the hand torch and actually weld all of those pieces together. The last step on that is then to weld on electrodes onto either end. Each one of those steps is very, very specific. I draw inspiration from so many different experiences. It's hard to come up with one thing that's particular, but one of the ways that I really am able to connect with the creative is to float. Floating is a similar experience to meditation, to psychedelics. Going into a blackened room and laying out in a body of water and salt that's heated to your body temperature, and it allows for all sort of external stimulation to fall away. And your internal world really begins to bubble up and manifest. You really get to experience a different relationship to your mind. I think I work with neon because I can't not work with it. It's so challenging and so rewarding. And those things are so intertwined that there's no way of separating it out. I've learned so much and continue to learn so much by working with it. I find so much inspiration in working with it, and I just continue to experience new and different things through the medium. It's that close to me at this point. Once the neon tube is completed, we have to hook it up to our manifold for bombarding. The manifold is opened, a vacuum is drawn. We check the tube for leaks with our Tesla coil. We close the tube back off, and we heat it up using a very large and powerful transformer. As the tube is heated up, it releases anything that's not inert inside the tube, and we evacuate that out. We introduce the gas into it, and we seal the tube off, sealing into that tube whatever gas we introduced into it. I think my favorite part of making a neon light is when I see it lit up for the first time. Different gases, when electrified, emit different wavelengths of light. Neon gas is this very bright orange, fiery red color. Argon gas creates a very intense blue, but that light output that is produced can then be expressed in a different wavelength by coating the inside of the tubes with a phosphor coating that takes that one wavelength of light and emits a different wavelength. We bring it over to the aging table where we hook it up to an age-in transformer and allow it to settle, age the gas in that we've introduced to it. There's always a stray particle of something left inside the tube. But that time that the oxide coating can act to scrub whatever is left inside the tube while things are getting settled into place. Once the tubes are aged in, we move on to our process of assembling two halves of the fixture together in a jig, gluing up the center of the fixture to its spindle. Once the adhesive dried, we would connect the wires from the fixture together into a transformer, and we turn on power and it lights up. Part of what we love about what we do here is that we try and put out into the world the kind of things that we'd like to see. I still am surprised when it lights up. I'm still excited when I get to see it illuminated. There's an ineffable quality to it. To me, it is this insight into the inner workings of the universe. It literally is. It's a way of looking at what is surrounding us in the cosmos in a new light.
It is noon right here in Hong Kong and in Shanghai. This is Bloomberg Markets. I'm Rashad Salamat.
And I'm Haslinda Amin. Here are our top stories. Most Asian stocks retreat ahead of U.S. CPI numbers, with fears faster inflation and surging commodities will test the recovery. Taiwan nears a correction as tech slumps and new COVID curbs rattle investors.
We'll break Toyota's earnings in about 25 minutes, set to dodge the damage done from the chips crisis, but its fiscal year forecast may steer toward the conservative.
Plus, we hear exclusively from Sinovac CEO as a real-world study reports strong protection from the Chinese company's controversial vaccine.
Asian markets certainly at the moment weak, and none weaker than the ones in Taiwan right now. Let's get over to Yvonne Mann. We've got COVID restrictions in place. On top of that, it's the fulcrum of geopolitical tensions between Washington and Beijing. On top of that, a semiconductor crisis. Is it the perfect storm?
Yeah, it certainly is a mix of all these factors that perhaps we're seeing such big moves in Taipei here at the moment. But keep in mind, this has been one of the world's best performing equity markets of this year. So perhaps we're taking some froth out of this market. 5% lower for your TAIEX right now. It's been interesting, the single day moves we've seen, one of the biggest since 1976. And keep in mind, though, these are some of the worst moves here since those daily price limits were loosened back in 2015. But we are seeing not as similar declines, but still in a red here when it comes to tech-heavy benchmarks like the Kospi. Nasdaq futures are also extending losses down by 0.8%. So this tech sell-off seems to be resuming itself after 1 day of pause overnight. U.S. futures, the S&P down 0.7%. MSCI China, we're watching the China reopen as well. They've been largely the exception here today in Asia, largely in positive territory throughout the day. It seems like we are slowly losing a bit of ground here. The CSI 300 back from that lunch break down 1/3%. Take a look at some of the biggest movers in Taipei. In general, we are seeing here, it's the chip makers, it's the tech stocks like Taiwan Semi, Hanhai. Taiwan Semi down 4.3% right now. Hanhai down some $7, and China Steel down as much as 10% here today. Watching some of these chip makers as well, like Samsung in Korea down 1.5% to 80,000 right now. And we're watching, of course, a lot of that inflation angst that still very much is percolating through these markets as well. You have that bond auction coming up later on in the U.S. You have the CPI report coming up later as well. So inflation angst still very much seen. You see treasuries hovering around 162 for your U.S. 10-year, but we have seen yields picking up across Asia as well. Australia in particular, after that big budget, that budget deficit bigger than expected. New Zealand as well. We saw those yields spiking some 5 basis points after that RBNZ QE operation. And of course, it's really what's been caused by all this is this commodities rally that continues to go from strength to strength, not just with the hard commodities, but in particular in the soft space here right now. Soybean futures, we've been talking about, has been in 9-year highs. We also saw palm oil in Malaysia hit a record 4,500 ringgit in Malaysia. So certainly something to watch here, but the tech sell-off in Taiwan, that's where the big story is today, Rish, and has.
Indeed. Randy Abrams, head of Taiwan Securities Research at Credit Suisse. Randy, good to have you with us. I mean, what's surprising is the size and speed of this decline. It does seem like a flash crash.
Yes, no, that's right. Yeah, thank you for having me on. I think for Taiwan market, the factor for that, this market this year has seen a surge of retail buying. Usually it's about 50% of trading volume. It's moved up to about 70 to 80% this year. And really that's a function of the last couple years has been quite well for Taiwan. It's been one of the strongest markets. We've had a good tech cycle. And on the back end of that, you've seen a good surge of buying. But then I think what's happened, we've largely been spared here of COVID-19 from the worst of the impact. And in the past week, really for the first time this epidemic, we've seen the community spread. Right now, still a handful of cases, where yesterday it was in the range of 6 or 7 cases. But it's sparking a bit of fear that it's the first time they've really been undetected where the spread came from. And so there is a fear it could begin to spiral to bigger caseload. The government's taking stance to try to control group activity and may tighten that further. So I think that is triggering some of the move in the market now where for the first time really COVID could hit home here.
Put that in perspective for us, Randy. You talk about how it's sparking a bit of fear, but these are such massive moves. And these companies were darlings of investors. I mean, what's really changed?
Yeah, I think so. I'll kind of say where the tech cycle is. We're still in a place of good strength, like just from some of the demand drivers that have been doing it. We're really not back to full reopening, so a lot of that consumer home demand, PC demand is still there, and you still have those ongoing, the cloud demand and 5G. So that part you could say is still similar. Now where we're at though, because things have been so strong, you do have a lot of skittishness about concerns about peaking metrics. When things are quite strong, can it get any better? So even in recent weeks before COVID, there's been a bit of profit taking. Now that we're getting through some well-expected good results. And so you're in a bit of a lull post the peak of results season. I think to calm markets down, it's ultimately I think two things really: the COVID, if they can contain it like they have before, and second, as we start to get toward mid-year and into third quarter, a reassurance really that we haven't really peaked, that we could have the stronger for longer cycle.
Randy, I was just throwing to Yvonne about this. Is it a perfect storm? We've got the same geopolitical issues playing out. Taiwan is right at the center of these tensions at the moment between Beijing and Washington. On top of that, you mentioned those restrictions with regards to COVID. Then we've got semiconductor problems. And on top of that, we had a tech sell-off in the US last night. So give us a sense of which way this is likely to end up.
I think for a short-term correction, it is the perfect storm that you just have, like you mentioned, a few events playing out. You've had strong interest, strong outperformance in the market, the first signs of COVID, a bit of global skittishness, and that couples with what you're seeing. It's a tech-heavy market, and you've seen that kind of shift from growth toward value. And so that puts it from kind of some of the COVID winners, which already you're seeing a bit of profit taking. Add on top of that, May, it's tax month here. And so you normally in a market where we've had a lot of retail, you get some selling, a typical sell in May, but a bit of that activity as well on top of it. So in that way, in a short term for a pullback from the strength, I think a few factors do play into it to trigger a bit of a correction. Along with what you mentioned, the geopolitical, there have been some headline stories from economists and other publications about geopolitical, where I think it's still not the imminent concern on the ground here, but it does draw some attention to the market in the middle of that.
Randy, do you think that people in the States and elsewhere in Europe will be looking at this and look at what they are likely to do with semiconductors? In other words, very shortly, is there likely to be a spillover?
Yeah, I think from that, for the semiconductor activity, we're seeing the big picture pieces as far as U.S., Europe trying to put more funding on the ground. From a capacity and building up fabs, because it takes so long to get to actual construction, that point is more multi-year phase. And so you'll continue to see those activities like Intel, TSMC, Samsung announcing some capacity in U.S. But ultimately for global shifts of capacity, it's just much longer running in action. I'd say still from customer decisions, it also happens relatively slowly. Their main consideration really is getting the best product out at the best cost on time to market. And so that's why even those purchasing decisions happen more gradually as well.
Randy, very quickly, you talk about it being possibly a short-term correction. Any reason to be buying the dip?
Yeah, my take, I think as we get into June, July, what could be the buy on the dip, there still are a couple good trends for tech, which are more multi-year in nature. 5G, we're still just second year of penetration. The cloud compute is still there and still healthy. And we're talking all about the auto shortages, but we're relatively early in auto industrial markets coming back. So I do think from resilient tech space on a pullback, and also you can say some of these companies in Taiwan, the leading tech companies, are still in a good position. So if we take some of the foundry design companies or ODMs, still in a good position to benefit from that. So I do think on the dip, we get a pullback through these couple months lull. We could be looking at heading into mid-year and second half, room to buy in